Princess Stephanie's marriage was a nightmare that came to an unthinkable end. Her husband and his mistress were found dead in an imperial hunting lodge. It appeared to be a twisted death pact, but the letter he left behind for Stephanie was the most disturbing part of all. Princess Stephanie of Belgium was not the average royal. After a brutal childhood, she married a beast of a husband whose fatalistic mood swings dashed her hopes of becoming empress. When she finally forged a path of her own, her actions created an irreparable rift in her family and shook the house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha down to its foundations. Princess Stephanie came into the world with a silver spoon in her mouth and a powder keg in her crib. Her parents, the Duke and Duchess of Brabant, were a wildly mismatched pair whose miserable marriage foreshadowed her own tragic union. At least she had the trappings of happiness. Stephanie hardly needed a husband to receive imperial treatment. Born on May 21, 1864 at the Palace of Laeken, her first days were filled with opulence befitting an empress. After an emergency baptism on the day of her birth, she had a second, lavish ceremony a month later. The event lasted a full hour and ended with a 60-guest gala. She was a lot closer to the throne than she knew. In 1865, not long after her birth, Stephanie took one step closer to ultimate power when her grandfather, King Leopold I, passed away. Her family would never be the same. Her father took the throne as Leopold II, while her beloved older brother became heir. But just a few years later, a tragic accident sent their worlds spiraling. Not even 3 years after losing her grandfather, Stephanie's family faced tragedy again. This time, her older brother Leopold fell into a pond. While he didn't drown, he didn't make it out unscathed. For months, Leopold suffered from pneumonia, ultimately succumbing to the horrifying illness. Stephanie's world would never be the same. Even though Stephanie was just 4 years old at the time, she felt the loss of her older brother particularly keenly. The first event that was deeply engraved in my memory, she later wrote in her memoirs, was the death of this beloved brother. Stephanie's parents also never recovered from the loss, and they were about to lose a whole lot more. In 1871, as typhus swept through Brussels, Stephanie became gravely ill. Her parents, fearing the loss of yet another child, stood beside her for weeks. With her life hanging by a thread, and the future of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha hanging with it, even the royal nanny wept openly. If it hadn't been for a mysterious figure, Stephanie would have joined her brother in the afterlife. Just as Stephanie and her family resigned themselves to her grim fate, a doctor from the Resens appeared with an unconventional remedy: cold baths. Against all odds, it worked. Stephanie's fever finally broke, and by October 1871, she was on the mend. She may have survived the illness, but her parents' marriage was terminal. Even as a child, Stephanie could see the fault lines in her parents' marriage. She later reflected, they did not understand each other. He chose that of indifference, infidelity. She had to accept that of resignation, loneliness, and pain. After Stephanie's brother passed, her father, King Leopold II, all but abandoned his surviving children. Obsessed with wealth and empire, he poured his energy into the brutal exploitation of the Congo and surrounded himself with an endless parade of mistresses. His subjects nicknamed him the King of the Belgians and of the Beauties. Stephanie, on the other hand, withdrew into her books. By 1874, 10-year-old Stephanie set aside her dolls and prepared herself for her royal duties. From that moment, she wrote, "Books and notebooks would take the place of my toys." Stephanie's royal curriculum sounded impressive. Languages, history, math, horsemanship, but in practice, it lacked depth. Her teachers focused more on decorative arts and needlework than real intellectual development. Unfortunately, her education prepared her for little more than to become a bride. Too bad she would marry a beast. Despite her royal pedigree, Stephanie's life behind palace walls was anything but pampered. We got up early in the morning, in summer, at 5 o'clock, in winter at 6 o'clock, she recalled. Even during her morning bathroom routine, her governess demanded complete silence. One wrong move and the housekeeper was ready to discipline her. For a princess, she lived like a prisoner in a palatial pen. While most of her princess peers cozied up to warm fires in grand castles, Stephanie shivered in the cold. Her keepers forced her to wear plain, belt-tied dresses and insisted that she live with open windows year-round, even in the middle of winter. Believe it or not, the freezing palace was warm compared to her father's love. Despite their royal status, Stéphanie and her sister Louise were made to clean their own room and remain silent during meals. Even family meals were frigid affairs. When her father entered the room for breakfast, Stéphanie would have to stand to greet him and kiss his hand. In return, he only gave her a pat on the head. No kisses, no words, no love. Still, that was more than she received from her governess. Even as princess, Stéphanie had no royal privileges. When she misbehaved, the consequences were severe. Her keepers made her kneel on dry peas or locked her in a pitch-black chamber between double doors. Her only comfort came from their kind-hearted nanny, Tony, whose tenderness stood out like a candle in the dark. But someone was about to enter her life who would extinguish even that small bright spot. In the winter of 1878, a fateful visitor came to Brussels, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, and Stéphanie's parents saw a perfect opportunity. With nuptials on their mind, they presented the 14-year-old Stéphanie to the Habsburg Empress, whose son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was still single. Before long, the royal rumor mill roared to life. On paper, it was the perfect match. With her pending nuptials to a man she never met, Stéphanie's housekeeper thought it best to give her a preview of what she could expect. During a literature lesson, the housekeeper brought out a magazine and showed young Stéphanie an engraving of the Crown Prince, dressed in his regalia for a hunt. It was supposed to be a lesson on the majesty of the Habsburgs. Instead, it was a reminder of the immense responsibility she was about to assume. Stéphanie may have been excited to marry Crown Prince Rudolf, but the feeling wasn't mutual. When Rudolf met 15-year-old Stéphanie in March 1880 for the first time, he called her pretty, good, clever. But behind his flattery was a hard truth. Stéphanie wasn't his first, or even second choice. She was simply the only Catholic princess who ticked the political boxes set by his controlling father. In truth, neither Stéphanie nor Rudolf had much of a say in the matter. Stéphanie didn't fall in love. She fell in line. After Rudolf's first visit, her parents summoned her the way a pet owner might summon their dog. Sternly, her father stood and declared, "We have chosen you to be Empress Austria and Queen of Hungary." However, it seemed like she had some competition. On March 7, 1880, the engagement became official. Rudolf arrived in Brussels with 21 attendants, and one glaring insult. Among his entourage was none other than his mistress, whom he didn't even bother to leave behind. "A new life will soon begin for me," he told his tutor, "and I must admit that this worries me a little." It didn't worry him nearly as much as it worried Stéphanie. Rudolf was a prince on paper, but in real life, he was a volatile storm. Prone to intense mood swings, he'd swing between moments of melancholy and mania, partying too hard and too often. The Austrian court hoped that his marriage to the comparatively docile and disciplined Stéphanie would settle him. Instead, it only tethered Stéphanie to his downfall. From the very beginning, it seemed that everyone knew what Stéphanie was walking into. That is, everyone except for Stéphanie. Countess Mary Larish, niece of Empress Elizabeth, summed up to the court's dread when she said, "In advance, we had pity on the poor princess who would have the honor of being chosen. But even if her marriage was fated to fail, it would at least be fashionable." On May 10, 1881, a week before her 17th birthday, Stéphanie married Rudolf in a crowded, chaotic ceremony at St. Augustine's Church in Vienna. The elite of Europe packed the pews, future kings, emperors, and knights jostling for space to witness the union of two great houses. It should have been the beginning of her fairy tale. Despite the warning signs, Stéphanie threw herself into the moment. "We exchanged alliances. The bells of the whole city rang," she remembered fondly. Music filled the streets and cheers echoed throughout Vienna. She really had become the crowned princess of Austria-Hungary, but she would regret it almost instantly. You see, Stéphanie's marital bliss ended just as soon as her wedding dress came off. The morning after the wedding, Stéphanie wrote a letter to her sister about the way Rudolf had treated her at night. "What torments, what horror, my illusions, my youthful dreams were shattered. I thought I should die of my disillusionment." Believe it or not, Rudolf was a nice one in his family. If Rudolph was mercurial, his mother was merciless, borderline malevolent. The Empress Sissy found Stéphanie tall, plain, and dull, and she didn't bother hiding her disdain. Behind her back, and sometimes to her face, she called Stéphanie the hideous dromedary. Still, Stéphanie was determined to find happiness in her marriage. Despite the rocky start, there was a time when Stéphanie believed she'd found a true partner in Rudolph. They gave each other pet names, and for a brief moment, she thought of him as a model husband. Their early days were full of laughter, inside jokes, and shared dreams. But happiness at court was always fleeting. Although married life made her the crowned princess of the most powerful empire in Europe, it also made her a prisoner. Rudolph, deeply paranoid, didn't like for Stéphanie to wander far, or anywhere at all. Her new husband didn't allow her to leave the palace grounds without his permission, so she made do, throwing herself into the arts and flexing her creativity through sketching and painting. But despite her bleak situation, she had a plan to earn her freedom. In late 1881, Stéphanie incorrectly suspected she might be pregnant. However, a little over a year later, in the spring of 1883, the real thing came along. Both she and Rudolph were ecstatic and utterly convinced the child would be a boy. But once again, reality had other plans. Instead of a boy and an heir, she had a daughter. While she was overjoyed to become a mother, Rudolph's reaction was decidedly less celebratory. But sadly, the worst was yet to come. Shamelessly chasing after his own desires, Rudolph threw himself after his mistresses. But by 1886, his health was failing, and the palace doctors whispered of stomach issues. But the truth was far darker. He'd contracted a venereal disease from one of his many affairs. The cover-up was elaborate. The consequences were catastrophic, particularly for Stéphanie. Desperate to hide the truth, Rudolph's doctors prepped him with a long list of curatives, including mercury. But the treatments weren't just outdated, they were toxic. The supposed cure began to rot him from the inside out, fracturing his already deeply troubled mind. Stéphanie was blissfully unaware of exactly how precarious her husband's situation had become. Sadly, she learned the truth the hard way. Rudolph, wanting to escape the court, retreated to the island of Lochram to recover, and dragged Stéphanie and their daughter along with him. But no one told Stéphanie the truth about her husband's mysterious illness. When she started falling ill herself, the doctors blamed peritonitis. In reality, she'd contracted the same disease, and she would pay the price for the rest of her life. Within a matter of mere months, with her own health taking a turn for the worse, Stéphanie learned the brutal truth. Rudolph likely had gonorrhea, and he'd given it to her. At just 21 years old, her illness had rendered her infertile. The imperial fairy tale had become a cruel joke. She could never bear another child, and the empire still had no male heir. The VD was a last straw for Stéphanie. Betrayed by her husband, robbed of her future, and isolated from joy, she shut down. She refused to share a bed with Rudolph, who now spent almost all of his nights in Vienna's more licentious quarters. Even as he made weak attempts to reconcile, the rift between them only widened. Thankfully for Stéphanie, someone stepped into the void. While visiting Galicia in 1887, Stéphanie met the Polish Count Artur Potocki, and sparks flew. For the next year and a half, she made no attempt to hide her affection for him. Rudolph, however, still vacillating between his love for Stéphanie and guilt over what he had done to her, continued spiraling deeper and deeper into vice. Stéphanie feared the worst. By 1887, things between Stéphanie and Rudolph were already tense, but then came the aggressive blow-ups. He was deeply unhappy and scarily unstable, and his public behavior turned dangerously erratic. He spoke openly of his own demise, as if he were rehearsing it. Behind palace walls, Stéphanie saw what others did not. Her husband was falling apart at the seams. In October 1888, terrified by Rudolph's downward spiral, Stéphanie went to her father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph, for help. She pleaded, "Rudolph is very ill," but the emperor waved her off. "It is your imagination that creates ghosts for you. Rudolph is doing very well," he replied coldly. It was the final denial before the disaster. In April 1888, Rudolph had begun an affair with the 17-year-old Baroness Mary Viscera. Less than a year later, in January of 1889, and just months after Stephanie's warning to the Emperor, the unthinkable happened. Rudolph and Vitsera were found at the Mayerling hunting lodge, each with a shot in the head. It appeared to all like a lover's pact. To Stephanie, Rudolph left a chilling note. "You are delivered from my fatal presence. I calmly enter death, which alone can save my good reputation." At just 24, Stephanie became a widow and a national scapegoat. Grief-stricken and suffocating in Vienna, Stephanie begged to return to Belgium to recover from the devastating news. However, neither Emperor Franz Joseph nor her father, King Leopold II, would grant her permission. Instead, they forced her to remain in Austria as the Dowager Crown Princess, quietly shamed and slowly erased. Still, there was one bright spot in her life. Even after Mayerling, Stephanie had one anchor, Count Artur Potocki. She gave him the nickname Hamlet, and he stayed close by her side as she mourned. Sadly, fate wasn't finished with her yet. In 1890, just about a year after losing Rudolph and her hope of becoming empress, Potocki was diagnosed with cancer. Instead of giving her time to mourn, Stephanie's father and father-in-law wanted her remarried, and soon. At first, they had their eyes on Archduke Franz Ferdinand, but Stephanie had her own idea. A Hungarian count named Elmer Lonier. There was just one problem. Or three. He was Protestant, barely older than her, and of a much, much lower rank. Nevertheless, her heart was set. Given Elmer's inferior status, Stephanie knew that her father wouldn't approve of the match. So, she wrote to Queen Victoria for support, hoping that the grandmother of Europe might bend his will in her favor. But she was terribly mistaken. When the Belgian king received Queen Victoria's letter, he was livid. He absolutely refused to Stephanie's consent despite the queen's encouragement. Consent, however, was the least of the things he withheld from his daughter. Infuriated at her insistence in marrying Elmer, Stephanie's Belgian family cut ties with her completely. Her father even forbade Stephanie's sister, Clementine, from writing to her. Leopold II wasn't done with his daughter yet. Had it not been for Stephanie's father-in-law, her own father would have stripped her of her titles and allowance. But the damage was already done. On March 20th, 1900, at Miramare Castle, Stephanie defied her father, her mother, and her imperial in-laws. After 11 long years of widowhood and mourning, she married Elmer. But her love cost her everything. Following her second marriage, Stephanie lost her imperial titles while her daughter stayed behind in Vienna. At least she had the public support. While Stephanie's family fumed over her defiance, the public watched on with awe and cheered her bold decision. In 1902, Stephanie was in London when she received word that her mother had passed. Heartbroken, she rushed to Spa to pay her respects, but she'd never get the chance. King Leopold II, still fuming over her morganatic marriage, wouldn't permit her at the funeral. Grieving and humiliated, she returned to London without saying a final goodbye. Her father wasn't done with her yet. 2 days before King Leopold II passed in 1909, he refused to see Stephanie one last time. But the salt in her emotional wound came after her father was buried. Once he was in the ground, she discovered the true depth of his betrayal. He'd left most of his fortune to his mistress. The rest he hid in shell companies to keep from Stephanie and her sisters. This last insult she wouldn't take lying down. Even the Belgian state took pity on Stephanie and offered her and her sisters a payout, 2 million francs each. At first, Stephanie accepted, then she changed her mind. What followed was a legal circus that dragged on for years, pitting Stephanie against the Belgian state and anyone who stood between her and her birthright. Eventually, Stephanie won the battle, walking away with 5 million francs. She may not have been an empress, but with her father's inheritance, she could certainly live like one. Stephanie lived to see the fall of imperialism and royal houses as World War I and World War II ravaged the European continent. In her later years, as long as her health allowed it, she and her husband traveled and mingled with fellow imperial exiles. In April 1945, as the Red Army swept into Hungary, the conflict darkened Stephanie's doorstep. But her days of meddling in imperial affairs were over. She and her husband fled their mansion for safety. Just months after finding peace at last, on August 23rd, Stephanie passed on, succumbing to a stroke at the age of 81. She never did become empress, but she did become independent in the end. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.